18 years, $84 million in deals. And they fired me while on vacation, so I unleashed my secret weapon. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that betrayal felt impossible? Ever built something so valuable that destroying it seemed unthinkable? My name is Paige Latham, and I've never lost a deal that mattered. But before I tell you how I brought down an entire company with a single file, let me ask you this. If this story resonates with your own corporate battles, will you hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this? Because what happened to me could happen to anyone climbing the corporate ladder. And if you want to hear more stories like this, real stories about fighting back against workplace betrayal, make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let me tell you exactly how 18 years of loyalty turned into the most expensive mistake my former company ever made. 18 years with Redwood and Pike Global. $84 million in closed contracts. When Fortune 500 CEOs wake up in cold sweats about their quarterly numbers, they call me. When hostile takeovers threaten to demolish generational wealth, I'm the one standing between chaos and catastrophe. But here's what they don't tell you about being indispensable. The moment you become too valuable to your company, you become too dangerous to your colleagues. I've pulled miracles from impossible deadlines, turned adversaries into allies, and transformed corporate disasters into legendary comeback stories. My corner office overlooks Manhattan's financial district, a throne earned through blood, sweat, and an unbreakable resolve to win. But what happens when the people you've made rich decide you're the problem? Jack understood this better than anyone. After 12 years of marriage, he'd watched me sacrifice vacations, anniversaries, even Christmas mornings for the sake of another deal. You're not indispensable, Paige, he'd say gently. The company won't collapse if you take a week off. Have you ever been so wrong about something that it changed your entire life? As I stood in our bedroom, folding clothes for our long overdue anniversary trip to Napa Valley, my phone buzzed with another urgent email. Kent Danner, our CFO, needed the Hawthorne contract finalized before I left. I ignored it. For once, the world could wait. But some betrayals are already in motion, lurking in boardrooms where loyalty goes to die. Promise me, Jack said, holding up my phone like evidence in a trial. No emails, no calls, no quick check-ins with the office. This week belongs to us. I laughed, snatching the device back. You act like I'm addicted to work. Paige, you once closed a $12 million acquisition while in labor with our nephew's birth. You FaceTimed into the delivery room. That was different. The client was in Tokyo, and the time zones, promise me. His blue eyes held that mixture of love and exhaustion I'd grown accustomed to. Jack had married a rising star, but somewhere along the way, that star had become a supernova, brilliant, powerful, and destructive to everything in its orbit. I promise, I said, meaning it. We drove to Napa in comfortable silence, his hand finding mine as vineyards blurred past our windows. For the first time in months, my shoulders relaxed. The merger with Westfield Holdings could survive without my constant oversight. Kent and the board had everything under control. At least, that's what I told myself. The boutique hotel was perfect, stone walls covered in ivy, a fireplace that crackled like old secrets, and wine that tasted like liquid starlight. We made love like newlyweds, laughed like teenagers, and planned a future that felt possible again. But paradise never lasts. Not for people like me. On our second night, I broke my promise. While Jack showered, I grabbed my phone. Just a quick glance, I told myself. One peek at my emails to ensure nothing catastrophic had happened in my absence. The voicemail notification made my blood freeze. Kent Danner, 11:47 p.m. I pressed play with trembling fingers. Paige, it's Kent. Listen, the board held an emergency meeting this morning. There's no easy way to say this, so I'll be direct. Your position has been eliminated, effective immediately. The vote was unanimous. You'll be hearing from HR tomorrow about severance packages and transition details. I'm sorry it went down this way. You've been an asset to this company, but sometimes business requires difficult decisions. The message ended with a mechanical beep that sounded like a death knell. Jack emerged from the bathroom, towel around his waist, and found me sitting motionless on the bed. "Paige. You look like you've seen a ghost." I played the message again, watching his expression shift from confusion to fury. 18 years, I whispered. 84 million in deals. I saved them from bankruptcy twice, and they fire me while I'm on vacation? Jack sat beside me, his warmth a stark contrast to the ice spreading through my veins. Why now? Why this way? I stared at the phone, pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Because I wasn't there to stop it. Sleep became impossible. While Jack lay beside me, I stared at the ceiling and dissected every conversation, every glance, every seemingly innocent comment from the past few months. Kent Danner had been circling like a vulture since the Westfield merger talks began. He'd questioned my client relationships, suggested that too much institutional knowledge rested in my hands. "We need to diversify our leadership dependencies," he'd said during one board meeting, his smile never reaching his eyes. I dismissed it as corporate buzzword nonsense. Now I recognized it for what it truly was, a power play. The merger with Westfield Holdings wasn't just about expansion, it was about golden parachutes. The buyout guaranteed massive bonuses for essential personnel. Kent had positioned himself as essential while painting me as expendable. But he'd made one critical miscalculation. I reached for my laptop and began scrolling through encrypted files. Financial projections, due diligence reports, regulatory compliance documents, all the moving pieces of the Westfield deal. Everything seemed normal until I found what I was looking for. The Hawthorne contract. 47 pages of legal complexity that I'd crafted personally. The cornerstone deal that made the entire merger possible. Hidden in subsection 12.4. 7 was my insurance policy, a trigger clause that only I knew existed. Without that clause properly activated, the contract would trigger regulatory red flags requiring complete renegotiation and reapproval. The SEC would flag it, the merger timeline would be shattered, and Westfield Holdings would face months of delays. Kent had fired the one person who held his future in her hands. He just didn't know it yet. "You're scaring me," Jack said over breakfast. "I can see the wheels turning in your head." I stirred my coffee mechanically, my mind racing through contingencies. They think they can discard me like I'm nothing. 18 years of loyalty, and they don't even have the courtesy to fire me to my face. "What are you planning, Paige?" I met his gaze. "I'm planning to remind them why they needed me in the first place." The Hawthorne contract wasn't just any deal, it was the linchpin holding the entire Westfield merger together. 47 pages of negotiations that had taken me 8 months to finalize. Every clause, every subsection, every seemingly innocuous detail had been crafted with surgical precision. Including the hidden trigger that I'd built into the regulatory compliance section. Without that trigger activated, the contract would fail its federal review. The SEC would flag it, the merger would stall, and Westfield Holdings would walk away. Hundreds of millions in projected revenue would evaporate overnight. I designed it as protection against exactly this scenario, corporate betrayal. If Redwood and Pike ever tried to cut me out, they'd discover that their most important deal was wired to self-destruct. "Where are you going?" Jack asked as I stood. "To get my property back." I had 24 hours before HR would officially terminate my access to company systems. 24 hours to reclaim what was rightfully mine before Kent realized what he'd done. The game was about to change, and I held all the cards. The Redwood and Pike satellite office in Boise was a modest affair, 3 floors of glass and steel housing our Western operations. Most employees worked remotely on weekends, making it the perfect place for what I needed to do. I'd flown out alone, leaving Jack at the hotel with promises to return by evening. He didn't ask questions, but the worry in his eyes spoke volumes. 12 years of marriage had taught him to recognize when I'd shifted into full tactical mode. My keycard still worked, HR hadn't processed the termination paperwork yet, a typical delay in corporate bureaucracy. I had maybe 24 hours before security protocols would be updated. Most employees worked remotely on weekends, making it the perfect window for what I needed to do. The Hawthorne file sat exactly where I'd placed it 6 months ago. 47 pages of legal architecture that represented the culmination of my career. But more importantly, it contained handwritten annotations in my margin, notes that proved my intellectual ownership of the trigger clause. I photographed every page with my personal phone, then carefully removed the original documents. This wasn't theft. The contract language belonged to me, crafted through my expertise and protected by intellectual property laws that Kent clearly didn't understand. As I prepared to leave, my phone buzzed. An email from Bradley Hutchinson, the CEO who'd approved my firing. "Paige, I need you to call me immediately. There's been a development with the Westfield deal." I smiled and deleted the message. Whatever development had occurred, it was about to get much worse. Kent's office occupied the northwest corner of the executive floor, with windows overlooking the Boise River. His mahogany desk was cluttered with merger documents and stress-induced coffee stains. 3 monitors displayed stock prices, financial projections, and what appeared to be a frantic email thread with Westfield executives. I placed a handwritten note in the center of his keyboard: "Next time you knife someone, make sure they're not holding the parachute." Paige, the metaphor was perfect. Kent had pushed me out of the plane, not realizing I controlled the only thing that could save him from hitting the ground. By Monday morning, when Westfield's legal team discovered the compliance issue, panic would consume every floor of our Manhattan headquarters. I locked the file cabinet and headed for the exit, timing my departure for before the Monday morning skeleton crew arrived. My presence here would remain undetected simply because no one would think to look until it was too late for Kent to respond. Walking through the empty hallways felt like visiting a graveyard. I'd built relationships in this building, closed deals that changed lives, and earned respect through sheer competence. Now those memories belonged to a woman who no longer existed, at least not as an employee of Redwood and Pike Global. But Paige Latham, the survivor? She was just getting started. My phone rang as I reached the parking garage. Bradley's number flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message: "Paige, whatever's happening with the Hawthorne contract, we need to talk. Call me back immediately." Too little, too late. Some bridges burn beautifully. By Sunday evening, my phone had become a weapon of mass destruction. 17 missed calls from Bradley. 12 from Kent. 6 from various board members who'd never bothered learning my first name. Even Gloria from HR had left a message, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. Jack found me on our hotel balcony, watching the sunset paint Napa Valley in shades of gold and crimson. "You've started a war, haven't you?" "I've started a reckoning," I corrected. The Westfield Holdings legal team had discovered the compliance issue exactly as I'd predicted. Without the trigger clause properly activated, the Hawthorne contract violated federal regulations regarding foreign asset acquisitions. The entire merger now hung in limbo while lawyers scrambled to understand what had gone wrong. My phone buzzed with a text from Kent: "We need the Hawthorne documentation immediately. Where are the activation codes?" I replied with a simple emoji: parachute. The beauty of my situation was its absolute clarity. I owned the intellectual property rights to the trigger clause through my original work contract. Even if they found a way to replicate the language, they couldn't legally implement it without my authorization. Kent had fired the one person who could save his career. "What happens now?" Jack asked. I leaned into his warmth, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. Now they learned the difference between being important and being indispensable. The first offer arrived an hour later. Full reinstatement with a 30% salary increase. I deleted it without responding. They'd have to do better than that. Monday morning brought an unexpected player to the game. While Bradley and Kent burned through phone batteries trying to reach me, a different call came in. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was unmistakable: Victoria Westfield, CEO of Westfield Holdings and one of the most formidable women in corporate America. A mess. Latham, I believe we have something to discuss. Her tone was warm but calculating, the voice of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. I understand there's been some turbulence regarding our pending merger. That's one way to put it, I replied. I'd like to propose a conversation. Face to face. Today, if possible. The invitation intrigued me. Victoria Westfield hadn't built a billion-dollar empire by accepting obstacles. If Redwood and Pike couldn't deliver the Hawthorne contract, she'd find another way to get what she needed. Where? I asked. San Francisco. My private office. I'll send a car. After she hung up, I found Jack in the hotel restaurant, methodically destroying a stack of pancakes while reading news reports about our merger complications on his tablet. Financial journalists were already speculating about the deal's collapse. I have to go to San Francisco, I said. He looked up, syrup dripping from his fork. Please tell me you're not about to do something irreversibly stupid. I'm about to do something irreversibly brilliant. There's a difference. The car arrived 90 minutes later, a black sedan with tinted windows and a driver who looked like he moonlighted as someone's bodyguard. As we pulled away from the hotel, my phone exploded with another barrage of calls from Redwood and Pike. I turned it off. Some conversations required complete focus. Victoria Westfield's office occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower that pierced San Francisco's skyline like a corporate spear. The elevator required biometric scanning, and armed security guards checked my identification twice before granting access. Victoria herself was smaller than I'd expected but radiated the kind of controlled intensity that made boardrooms go silent. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her dark eyes missed nothing as she gestured for me to sit across from her mahogany desk. Coffee? Wine? Something stronger? She asked. Information, I replied. What exactly do you want from me? She smiled, a predator recognizing another predator. Direct. I like that. The merger with Redwood and Pike has hit an unexpected snag. According to my legal team, you're the only person who can resolve it. And according to my former legal team, I no longer work for Redwood and Pike. Former? Her eyebrow arched. How refreshingly honest. Though I have to ask, why should I trust someone who was just terminated by their own company? For all I know, you're a disgruntled employee looking to cause maximum damage. I leaned forward. Because I'm not offering to sabotage them further. I'm offering to fix what they broke. There's a difference. Explain. They fired me because they thought I was expendable. They were wrong. Now they have a deal that can't close without my cooperation, and you have a merger that's dead in the water unless someone can navigate the regulatory complications. Victoria studied me for a long moment. What makes you think I need you specifically? Because rebuilding the Hawthorne contract from scratch would take 18 months and cost you $40 million in delays. I can fix it in a week. She smiled. A predator recognizing another predator. Now you have my attention. She slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a consulting contract with Westfield Holdings. The compensation section made my breath catch, $2 million for 6 months of work, with performance bonuses that could double that amount. You'd be our point person for the acquisition. Full authority to negotiate terms, implement solutions, and ensure regulatory compliance. Essentially, you'd finish what you started. But for us instead of them. The irony was perfect. Kent had fired me to eliminate competition for the merger bonuses. Now I was being offered more money than he'd see in 5 years. What about the Hawthorne contract? I asked. Victoria's smile turned predatory. Leave that to me. While I was meeting with Victoria Westfield, the Manhattan headquarters of Redwood and Pike Global had descended into barely controlled chaos. Bradley Hutchinson paced his corner office like a caged animal, fielding calls from increasingly agitated board members. The Westfield merger represented 18 months of negotiations and the company's entire growth strategy for the next decade. Without it, stock prices would crater and heads would roll. Kent Danner sat in the conference room, surrounded by lawyers who looked like they'd been awakened at gunpoint. Technical documents covered every surface, but the conclusion remained unchanged. The Hawthorne contract was legally sound but functionally incomplete without the trigger clause activation. "Can't we just rewrite the problematic sections?" asked Diana Foster, the head of legal. "We tried," Kent replied. "The clause is integrated throughout the entire contract structure. Removing it would require renegotiating 47 pages of terms, which would take months and trigger new regulatory reviews. So we're hostage to one disgruntled employee?" Bradley's voice carried the kind of rage that ended careers. Kent shifted uncomfortably. "She owns the intellectual property rights to the specific language. Even if we could replicate it, we can't implement it without her authorization." The room fell silent as the full scope of their predicament became clear. In their rush to eliminate Paige Latham, they'd created a nightmare scenario where their most important deal depended entirely on the cooperation of someone they'd just betrayed. Bradley's phone rang. The caller ID showed Victoria Westfield's direct line. "Victoria, thank God you called. We're working around the clock to resolve, Bradley." Her voice cut through his desperation like a blade. "I'm calling to inform you that the merger terms have changed." The blood drained from his face. "Changed how?" "Ms. Latham now works for me." The conference room at Westfield Holdings buzzed with predatory energy as Victoria's team outlined their new strategy. I sat at the head of the table, feeling like Alice who'd suddenly found herself running Wonderland. "Here's what we know," Victoria said, addressing the room. "Redwood and Pike fired their most valuable asset and handed her to us on a silver platter. They can't complete the Hawthorne contract without Ms. Latham's cooperation, which means they can't fulfill their side of the merger agreement." The legal implications were staggering. Without the Hawthorne deal, Redwood and Pike would default on multiple contract provisions. Westfield Holdings could either walk away entirely or renegotiate from a position of absolute strength. "What do you recommend?" Victoria asked me. I studied the merger documents spread across the table. 18 months of negotiations, hundreds of millions in projected revenue, and dozens of careers hanging in the balance. Kent had wanted to eliminate me as a threat to his ambitions. Instead, he'd handed me the power to determine his company's future. "We renegotiate," I said. "But not with the same terms. Redwood and Pike needs this merger more than you need them. Their stock price has already dropped 12% since news of the compliance issues leaked. By Friday, they'll be desperate enough to accept almost anything." "And the Hawthorne contract?" I smiled. "I activate the trigger clause once we have a new agreement. Until then, their flagship deal remains broken." Victoria nodded approvingly. "I knew you were the right person for this job." My phone vibrated with another call from Bradley. I rejected it and turned the device face down. Some people had to learn the hard way that burning bridges was a permanent decision. "Shall we draft our counteroffer?" Victoria asked. The revolution had officially begun. By Wednesday, Bradley Hutchinson had aged 5 years in 3 days. The financial press was circling like sharks. The Wall Street Journal had run a front-page story about merger complications, while Bloomberg was reporting on executive departures and compliance irregularities. Redwood and Pike stock had dropped 15% in 2 trading sessions. Board members were demanding explanations he couldn't provide. 3 major clients had called emergency meetings to discuss relationship continuity. The company's credit rating was under review. He finally reached me during lunch at a Michelin-starred restaurant in San Francisco, where Victoria and I were celebrating our newly signed consulting agreement. "Paige, thank God. We need to talk." "Bradley," I said, my voice pleasant but cold. "How nice to hear from you. I understand you approved my termination while I was on vacation." "Classy move." That was a mistake. A misunderstanding. Kent convinced the board that restructuring was necessary for the merger, but he didn't explain the full implications of your departure. I almost laughed. After 18 years of working together, Bradley was trying to claim ignorance about my importance to the company. What do you want? We want you back. Full reinstatement, executive vice president title, 40% salary increase, and a guaranteed position on the board of directors after the merger. The offer was generous. More generous than anything I'd expected. 2 weeks ago, it would have been a dream promotion. Now it felt like an insult. Counteroffer, I said. I decline. Paige, be reasonable. We're offering you everything you've ever wanted. You're offering me what you should have given me years ago, when I was still naive enough to believe that loyalty meant something. But you fired me instead. On vacation. Via voicemail. Name your price. I looked across the table at Victoria, who was listening to every word with obvious amusement. My price isn't money, Bradley. It's respect. And that's something you can't afford. I hung up and turned off my phone. The wine tasted better than victory. Thursday brought a development that no one had anticipated. While reviewing the Hawthorne contract for Westfield's legal team, I discovered something that confirmed my worst suspicions about industry practices. A second regulatory flaw buried even deeper in the documentation. This wasn't a trigger clause I'd designed, it was a systematic error in the regulatory framework that I'd suspected for months but never had time to investigate thoroughly. The implications were staggering. For years, I'd noticed inconsistencies in how companies filed foreign acquisition documents. The regulatory template itself had a fundamental coding error that invalidated acquisitions above $50 million. Not only was the Redwood and Pike merger compromised, but dozens of other deals across multiple industries were potentially illegal. I'd stumbled onto a legal time bomb that made my original leverage look like a firecracker. Victoria studied the documentation with the focus of a surgeon examining a tumor. How many companies are affected? At least 30, possibly more. The regulatory framework they've been using has a fundamental flaw that invalidates foreign asset acquisitions above $50 million. And you're the only person who's identified this? As far as I know, yes. The error is buried in subsection references that most lawyers wouldn't think to cross-check. She leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting from concern to something approaching admiration. Do you realize what this means? I did. This wasn't just about the Redwood and Pike merger anymore. This was about positioning Westfield Holdings as the solution to an industry-wide crisis. Companies would pay enormous consulting fees to fix their compliance issues before federal regulators discovered the problem. We could build an entire practice around this, I said. Victoria smiled. Ms. Latham, I think you've just earned yourself a permanent position. The phone rang. Bradley again. This time, I answered. Bradley, I hope you're sitting down. We need to have a very different conversation. Friday morning brought a call that made my blood freeze. Agent Patricia Coleman, Securities and Exchange Commission. Ms. Latham, we need to discuss some irregularities we've discovered in recent regulatory filings. Specifically, the Hawthorne contract and several related acquisitions. I was in Victoria's office when the call came in. She gestured for me to put it on speaker. Agent Coleman, I'm listening, I said carefully. Our enforcement division has been reviewing foreign asset acquisitions filed under Regulation 47B. We've identified potential compliance violations that could affect multiple companies. Your name appears as the primary architect on several of these contracts. The irony was perfect. The same regulatory framework that I'd used to create leverage against Kent Danner had attracted federal attention. My hidden trigger clauses, designed to protect against corporate betrayal, now looked suspicious to investigators trained to detect financial manipulation. Are you suggesting impropriety? I asked. I'm suggesting we need to understand the structural elements of these contracts. The filing patterns suggest coordinated activity that may violate federal securities law. Victoria's expression had shifted from confidence to concern. Federal investigations could destroy careers and companies with equal efficiency. Even innocent parties could spend years in legal limbo while prosecutors built their cases. I'd like to cooperate fully, I said. But I'll need to consult with my attorney first. Of course. We'll be in touch to schedule a formal interview. After she hung up, Victoria and I sat in silence for several minutes. How bad is this? She finally asked. That depends, I replied, on whether they think I'm a whistleblower or a conspirator. The game had just evolved again, and this time the stakes were criminal. The SEC investigation changed everything, but it also created an unexpected opportunity. After consulting with Westfield's legal team, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. I called Agent Coleman and offered to cooperate as a confidential informant. I designed those trigger clauses as protection against corporate misconduct, I explained during our video conference. I can help you understand how companies are using regulatory loopholes to circumvent federal oversight. Agent Coleman was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who looked like she'd prosecuted white-collar criminals before breakfast. What kind of misconduct? Executive teams are manipulating merger timelines to maximize personal compensation while minimizing regulatory scrutiny. The Redwood and Pike situation is just the tip of the iceberg. I outlined how Kent Danner had orchestrated my firing to eliminate competition for merger bonuses, how the board had approved obviously flawed regulatory filings to accelerate deal timelines, and how multiple companies were using similar tactics to game the system. Are you willing to wear a wire? She asked. The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Wearing a wire meant crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. It meant becoming a federal informant against people I'd worked with for nearly 2 decades. But Kent Danner had made this choice when he decided to destroy my career via voicemail. Yes, I said. I'll wear a wire. Victoria squeezed my hand under the table. We discussed this possibility, and she'd promised full support. Westfield Holdings had nothing to hide from federal investigators, which made them the perfect ally for what was coming next. When do we start? I asked. Agent Coleman smiled. How about Monday morning? Monday arrived with the weight of historical inevitability. I stood in the bathroom of a downtown San Francisco hotel, watching Agent Coleman tape a wireless microphone to my chest. The device was smaller than a quarter but carried the power to end careers and send people to federal prison. Remember, she said, we need clear evidence of intentional misconduct. If they admit to manipulating regulatory filings or discuss bribing officials, we have them. If they just complain about business problems, we have nothing. I nodded, my mouth too dry for conversation. In 30 minutes, I would walk into Redwood and Pike San Francisco satellite office for an emergency meeting with Kent Danner and Bradley Hutchinson. They believed I was finally ready to negotiate my return. They were wrong. You don't have to do this, Victoria reminded me as I prepared to leave the hotel. We have enough leverage to destroy them financially. Criminal prosecution is a different kind of warfare. They chose the battlefield when they fired me on vacation, I replied. I'm just choosing the weapons. The satellite office felt different now, like a crime scene waiting to be discovered. Kent and Bradley were waiting in the conference room, their faces showing the strain of a week spent watching their company's stock price crater. Paige, Bradley stood to greet me. Thank you for coming. We know this situation has been complicated. I sat across from them, the wire transmitting every word to federal agents in a van 3 blocks away. Complicated is one word for it. Kent leaned forward. We need to discuss the regulatory filing issues. Off the record. Perfect. I activated the secondary recording device in my purse, insurance against technical failures. I'm listening. What happened next would determine whether I was a hero or a criminal. The truth is, Kent said, glancing around the conference room, we've been operating under aggressive timeline interpretations. What does that mean exactly? I pressed. Bradley shifted uncomfortably. We've had to be creative with filing sequences to meet investor expectations. Creative how? Kent hesitated. Look, everyone in our sector works within flexible compliance windows. The regulatory framework has gray areas. Kent, I designed half those filings. What specific gray areas are you talking about? He looked trapped. Fine. We've been submitting preliminary documentation to establish filing dates, then completing full compliance reviews afterward. It's not technically, that's filing false documents, I interrupted. You're claiming regulatory compliance you haven't achieved yet. It's standard practice, Kent insisted. The SEC doesn't have resources to audit every submission in real time. By the time they review anything, we've corrected any technical deficiencies. And if they catch the timing discrepancies? Bradley leaned forward. They won't. This is how business gets done, Paige. You know that. What about the Hawthorne contract specifically? Kent's expression darkened. That was supposed to be bulletproof. Clean documentation, perfect compliance, no corners cut. Then we discovered your little safeguard. It wasn't sabotage, I said. It was protection against exactly this kind of thing. I felt sick listening to them casually describe federal crimes as business strategy. These were people I'd worked with for years, people whose children I'd met at company picnics. Now they were confessing to securities fraud like they were discussing weekend golf plans. The Hawthorne contract was supposed to be our masterpiece, Kent continued. Clean documentation, perfect compliance, bulletproof regulatory approval. Then we discovered your little trigger clause trick. It wasn't a trick, I said. It was protection. Protection from what? I looked directly into his eyes. From people like you. The room fell silent. Kent's expression shifted from desperation to something approaching hatred. You sabotaged our biggest deal to get revenge for a termination you brought on yourself. I protected intellectual property that belonged to me. There's a difference. Bradley tried to play peacemaker. Paige, we can fix this. All of it. We'll reinstate you, give you anything you want, and you can activate whatever codes are necessary to complete the merger. And the regulatory violations? Kent waved dismissively. We'll file corrected documentation. Pay whatever fines are necessary. The SEC will slap our wrists and move on. That was the confession Agent Coleman needed. Kent had just admitted to knowingly filing false regulatory documents and planning to cover up federal crimes with monetary payments. I stood to leave. I'll consider your offer. As I walked toward the door, Kent called after me. Paige, I hope you understand the consequences of destroying this company. A lot of innocent people will lose their jobs. I turned back one final time. You should have thought about that before you fired me on vacation. The Wire had captured everything. The federal raid on Redwood and Pike Global's Manhattan headquarters began at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in late October. 43 agents with search warrants swept through 15 floors of corporate offices, seizing computers, financial records, and filing cabinets full of documentation that would take prosecutors months to analyze. The images broadcast on financial news networks showed executives being led away in handcuffs while reporters shouted questions about securities fraud and regulatory manipulation. Kent Danner was arrested at his home in Connecticut while eating breakfast with his family. Bradley Hutchinson tried to claim executive privilege before realizing that corporate executives don't enjoy the same constitutional protections as government officials. I watched the coverage from Victoria's office in San Francisco, feeling a mixture of vindication and sadness. These had been my colleagues once upon a time. Now they were defendants in a federal criminal case that would define the rest of their lives. Any regrets? Victoria asked. About the investigation? No. They made their choices. About leaving? I considered the question seriously. A week ago, I'd been Paige Latham, senior executive at a prestigious financial firm. Now I was Paige Latham, federal informant and senior consultant at an even more prestigious firm. The transformation felt surreal, like waking up in someone else's life. I missed the illusion, I finally said. For 18 years, I believed that competence and loyalty would be rewarded. That corporate leaders were fundamentally decent people making difficult decisions. It was comforting to live in that fantasy. And now? Now I know better. And knowledge, however painful, is always preferable to ignorance. My phone buzzed with a text from Jack. Saw the news. Are you okay? I typed back, better than okay. Coming home tonight. The game was finally over. And I had won. 6 months later, I sat in my new corner office at Westfield Holdings, watching the Manhattan skyline glitter in the late afternoon sun. The view was better than my old office, the salary was double what Redwood and Pike had ever paid me, and my title, Senior Vice President of Strategic Acquisitions, carried the kind of authority I'd spent 2 decades earning. The federal trials were still pending, but Kent Danner had already pleaded guilty to securities fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence. Bradley Hutchinson was fighting the charges, but his legal bills had bankrupted him months ago. The company itself had been broken apart and sold to various competitors, with Westfield Holdings acquiring the most profitable divisions. Still, the industry watched me carefully now. Some viewed me as a whistleblower hero who'd exposed systematic corruption. Others saw me as a dangerous insider who'd turned on her own company for personal gain. Client meetings often began with careful probing about my reliability and discretion. The federal oversight hadn't disappeared either. Agent Coleman still called occasionally, checking on industry developments that might require further investigation. My name remained in regulatory databases as a confidential informant, a designation that would follow me for years. Jack found me at my desk, reviewing acquisition proposals for 3 different companies. He'd driven into the city for dinner, our monthly tradition since I'd started traveling more for work. How does it feel? He asked, gesturing toward the news coverage playing silently on my office television. A financial journalist was discussing the final settlement in the Redwood and Pike case. The SEC had recovered over $200 million in fraudulent transactions, and new regulations had been implemented to prevent similar schemes. It feels like justice, I said. Expensive, complicated justice that comes with its own complications. Such as? I gestured toward a stack of compliance reports on my desk. The industry doesn't trust reformers. Half my clients see me as a necessary evil, someone who might expose their secrets if they cross me. The other half think I'm a federal informant looking for my next case. Are you? I smiled. I'm a survivor who learned that sometimes burning bridges is the only way to build better ones. But bridges made from ashes are never quite as stable as the ones that came before. Jack smiled and kissed my forehead. My wife, the corporate crusader. We left the office together, walking through corridors filled with people who respected my expertise rather than tolerating my ambition. The transformation felt complete, from disposable employee to indispensable consultant, from corporate victim to federal hero. As we stepped onto the street, my phone rang. Victoria's assistant with news about a potential acquisition in Phoenix. I looked at Jack, who nodded understanding. Some opportunities couldn't wait. Tell Victoria I'll take the meeting, I sigh. After all, I had a reputation to maintain. And this time, it belonged entirely to me. Jack squeezed my hand as we walked toward the car. So what's next for the woman who brought down an empire? I smiled, thinking about all the executives out there who might be facing their own Kent Danners right now. You know what? More people need to hear stories like this. Real stories about fighting back when corporations betray the people who built them. You should tell it, Jack said. Publicly. Let people know they don't have to take this kind of treatment lying down. Maybe I will. I paused, looking back at the Westfield building. And if I do tell this story, I hope people don't just listen, I hope they share it with others who need to hear it. Leave comments about their own experiences. Build a community of people who refuse to be corporate casualties. Jack laughed. Sounds like you're planning to start a movement. Maybe I am. And maybe the people who connect with that movement will want to follow along for more stories like this one. Because trust me, this is just the beginning. As we drove away, I thought about all the Kent Danners out there, all the companies betraying loyal employees, all the people who needed to know that fighting back was possible. If you're one of those people, if this story spoke to you, don't just read it and move on. Hit that like button if you believe loyalty should go both ways. Share this with someone who's facing their own corporate betrayal. Drop a comment below and tell me about your own workplace battles. I read every single one. And if you want more stories about fighting back against corporate injustice, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because I've got plenty more where this came from. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just winning, it's showing others how to win too.